On March 31, 2009, Benjamin Netanyahu was sworn in as Prime Minister of Israel. Barring an 18-month period between June 2021 and December 2022, he has been in power ever since, making him the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history. What is strange about Netanyahu's political success is that he is such a divisive politician, one who has survived by constantly finding new allies. That will keep him in power. Meanwhile, he has faced constant charges of corruption and has reshaped Israeli politics. How has this highly controversial individual managed to hold on to power for so long? And what are his views and motivations? This is the story of Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's most influential modern politician. The man known to history as Benjamin Netanyahu was born on October 21, 1949, in the city of Tel Aviv in Israel. The country had only come into existence a year and a half earlier, when the Israeli Declaration of Independence was issued on May 14, 1948, to erect Israel out of the British Mandate for Palestine, a pseudo-colony that had been controlled by the British in this part of the Middle East since the end of the First World War. Benjamin's father was Benjamin Netanyahu. He was born in Warsaw in 1910 in Congress, Poland, a part of the Russian Empire. Benjamin's surname was initially Milakovsky. The family changed the name to Netanyahu after migrating to Mandatory Palestine in 1920, a surname which means given by Yahweh, or given by God. Benjamin's father Nathan was a rabbi, but Benjamin was less religious and became a historian who produced important work on the history of the Jewish community in medieval Spain, prior to their forced coercion and mass expulsion in the late 15th century. Benjamin was also a staunch Israeli nationalist and an advocate of the concept of a Greater Israel, the idea that any Israeli state should incorporate all of Mandatory Palestine and lands surrounding it, such as parts of modern-day Jordan, the Golan Heights, South Lebanon, and the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. At the time of Benjamin's birth, Benjamin was in flux, debating whether to continue his efforts to acquire a position in academia or to enter politics. He had married Benjamin's mother, Zila Siegel, in 1944. They had 3 children, all boys. Benjamin was the middle child. An older son, Yonatan, was born in 1946, while the youngest, Ida, was born in 1952. Sila had been born in Pita, east of Tel Aviv, in 1912. Her family had migrated to the territory, which was still part of the Ottoman Empire at the time. In 1911, having come from Minneapolis in the United States, they had moved to America from Lithuania in the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire in the 1870s at a time of pronounced anti-Semitism in the Russian lands. Benjamin was not quite born into a country at war. A shaky peace had been established in 1949, at the end of the First Arab-Israeli War. The conflict had long roots. The Jewish people had been scattered at various junctures, from the Levant, the region of the Middle East, running along the coastal region of the Eastern Mediterranean and further east, towards the Dead Sea and the River Jordan. For instance, the fallout from the First Jewish Revolt against Roman rule between 66 AD and 73 AD had led to many Jewish people migrating to North Africa and Europe in ancient times. They experienced sustained anti-Semitism in many of their adopted homelands over the centuries. Anti-Jewish sentiment was increasing in Europe in the late 19th century, out of which the Zionist movement was born. The idea that the Jews would return to their ancient homeland and establish a new Zion there, a state of Israel. Jewish people began migrating in modest enough numbers to the Ottoman-controlled territories in the Levant between the 1880s and early 1900s. At this early stage, they bought up land there to establish their new Jewish settlements. The Siegels were amongst these earlier settlers. The really intense period of Jewish migration began after the First World War, once the British had taken over the region. All throughout the interwar period, there was a debate about how the mandate would be divided up between the Arab Muslim Palestinians and the Jewish community. That debate became particularly intense after the Second World War and the Holocaust in Europe. Violent opposition to the continuation of British rule resulted in the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem by the Irgun, a Zionist paramilitary organization, on July 22, 1946, killing 91 people thereafter. The British had moved to disentangle themselves from Mandatory Palestine, a United Nations plan to divide the mandate into two countries, Jewish Israel and Muslim Palestine, was drawn up in 1947, but it was rejected primarily by the Palestinians, leading to Israel's unilateral declaration of independence in May 1948, claiming all of the mandatory territory. The First Arab-Israeli War followed, as Israel's neighbors Egypt, Transjordan, Syria and Lebanon, among others, attacked the new state to reclaim the Palestinian regions. The war had ended a few months before Benjamin was born, with Egypt taking control over the Gaza Strip and Transjordan occupying the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Benjamin's early life was characterized by a dual American-Israeli identity. During the Second World War, his father, Ben Zion, had moved to the United States to act as part of the Zionist lobby group there that sought to influence the U.S. government towards a more sympathetic view of Zionism. In the context of the unfolding Holocaust in Europe, in 1947, Ben Zion had been a signatory to a letter that was published in the New York Times that opposed the proposal for dividing the British mandate into two states. Hence, the family already had ties to the U.S. When Benjamin was born, and in the mid-1950s, the Netanyahu family relocated to Pennsylvania so that Ben Zion could take up a position as professor of Hebrew language and literature at Dropsy University in Philadelphia, the first advanced Jewish university in America. Later, Ben Zion took up a position at Cornell University in New York State. All of this meant that, while Benjamin and his siblings did spend a considerable amount of time back in Israel, a lot of their youth was spent growing up in America. While Benjamin, his parents, and two brothers were moving over and back between Israel and the U.S., Israel's borders were shifting, along with its international status. Egypt had been a de facto British colony from 1882 onwards, as the British Empire's interest in the country had become highly important once the Suez Canal was opened in 1869. Egypt gradually acquired more independence following the First World War, but even during the conflict against Nazi Germany between 1939 and 1945, Egypt remained the primary base of operations for the British in North Africa. That situation was overturned following the war. On July 23, 1952, the Egyptian Revolution occurred, a military coup which brought the pan-Arab nationalist Gamal Abdul Nasser to power in 1954. In July 1956, he nationalized the Suez Canal, which Britain and France had retained a controlling influence over up until that point. This action triggered the Second Arab-Israeli War, better known as the Suez Crisis, when Israel invaded Egypt on October 29, in part so that it could end an Egyptian blockade of Israeli shipping through the Straits of Tiran and the Gulf of Aqaba. The war lasted for a week and a half. Late on in it, Britain and France joined the Israelis, though, crucially, the United States was opposed to the conflict. The crisis had, consequently, shown there were limits to American support for Israel. At that time, in the years that followed, different Palestinian nationalist movements began to emerge primarily within the newly independent, oil-rich Gulf states, like Kuwait, where many migrants of Palestinian origin had settled following their expulsion from Israel in 1948. Several of these individuals had been in Egypt during the Second Arab-Israeli War and had fought in the conflict in 1956. 1959, they founded FOTA in Kuwait. 5 years later, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or P, was established as an umbrella organization for the various Palestinian militant movements. In 1969, Yasser, an Egyptian-born militant with Palestinian heritage, became the chairman of the PLO. He would play an important part in Netanyahu's story for decades to come. Netanyahu returned to Israel in the midst of this shifting political situation. He had attended the Cheltenham High School in Pennsylvania and then headed to Israel to join the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, in 1967 as he turned 18. The timing was significant. The Six-Day War had just been fought between the 5th and the 10th of June 1967. The immediate spark of it was, again, over Israeli access to the Red Sea. Israel had subsequently invaded Egypt, and in a swift military campaign of 6 days, had taken over the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. This was broadly a realization of the goal of many Zionists like Benjamin Netanyahu, who had called for the creation of a greater Israel decades earlier, though the new dispensation would not last long. The military situation was tense as a result of the Six-Day War when Netanyahu joined the IDF. Nobody knew when Egypt, or one of Israel's other neighbors, might try to strike back. Moreover, FOTA and the PLO were increasingly active from Jordan, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, where the Palestinian emigre population now outnumbered the Jordanians. Netanyahu served in the period that followed as part of the Special Operations Unit, CRA. He took part in incursions into Jordan and Egypt as part of the undeclared war of attrition that followed the Six-Day War, and was apparently nearly killed in a mission in the Sinai in May 1969. Netanyahu was discharged from the IDF in 1972 and returned to America there. He started studying architecture at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. However, he was soon on his way back to Israel. On October 6, 1973, an Arab coalition of Egypt, Syria, the PLO, and other Arab groups invaded Israel in a surprise mass attack on the Feast of Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism. The War of Yom Kippur reversed many of the Israeli gains made in the Six-Day War back in 1967. Egypt reclaimed some of its lost territory. More importantly, the war convinced many within Israel that negotiations would be needed with Israel's neighbors if it was ever to achieve a lasting security situation. The 3-week conflict led to Netanyahu briefly returning to Israel to rejoin the IDF. He formed the opposite view from the war. While Egypt reclaimed the Sinai Peninsula, in the long term, Israel managed to retain control over the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights that it had occupied in 1967. As such, Netanyahu formed the view that even a united Arab alliance engaging in a surprise attack could not defeat Israel. Thus, Israel could survive as a security state. As he would later state, the Yom Kippur War showed our neighbors that they cannot defeat us with weapons. This would inform his political outlook for the rest of his life. In the aftermath of the conflict, he returned to America and completed his studies at MIT, graduating with a BSc in architecture and then an MA in business management. He also started a family for the first time. In 1972, he had married his first wife, Miriam Weitzman, who he met during his service with the IDF. They had one daughter, Noah. Born in 1978, around the time Miriam was pregnant, Benjamin began an affair with a British student by the name of Fleur Cates. He divorced Miriam not long afterwards and married Fleur in 1981, after she converted to Judaism. This second marriage did not result in any children. A defining moment in Netanyahu's life occurred in the summer of 1976. His older brother had remained a member of the IDF for longer than Benjamin did, and was a senior commander within the Special Forces. By 1976, he was selected to lead what was codenamed Operation Thunderbolt that summer, though it is more usually referred to as the Entebbe Raid. After Entebbe International Airport in Uganda, where the mission took place. On June 27, 1976, an Air France flight, flying from Tel Aviv to Paris, with a stopover in Athens, was hijacked by members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. They diverted the plane to Libya and then Uganda, where their actions were celebrated by the Ugandan dictator, Idi Amin. Operation Thunderbolt was launched to rescue the hostages at The resulting raid on July 4, 1976, was a success from the Israeli perspective and led to the rescue of just over 100 Israeli hostages. The non-Jewish hostages had already been released. Prior to the raid, however, one Israeli soldier, Yonatan Netanyahu, was shot and killed during the operation at Netanyahu was already a Zionist, opposed to seeking a more peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by the 1970s. But the death of his brother during the Entebbe raid further entrenched his views. In 1976, after he graduated with his MA in business management, Netanyahu began working for Boston Consulting Group, a management consulting firm. He returned yet again to Israel in 1978 and set up the Yonatan Netanyahu Anti-Terror Institute, while also beginning to dip his toes into politics for the first time. A period of time working in business in Jerusalem was followed by another return to the United States, this time as the second most senior diplomat in the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. between 1982 and 1984. A key moment in Israeli politics, as the country had entered directly into the Lebanese Civil War. In 1984, following the end of the sixth-year term of Yehuda Blum, Netanyahu succeeded as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. Over the next 4 years, Netanyahu established a reputation for being a fierce defender of Israel on the international stage and an opponent of UN efforts to broker a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Then, in 1988, he returned to Israel and gained election to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, standing as a member of a right-wing party that had been formed in 1973, only weeks before the War of Yom Kippur. This fortuitous timing had seen the party surge in popularity from the very first election it took part in December 1973, and it emerged on top of most elections from 1977 down to 1992. After winning election as a parliamentarian with Likud in 1988, Netanyahu was immediately made deputy minister for foreign affairs. While Netanyahu was rapidly ascending in Israeli politics, changes were occurring quickly in the wider Levant and further afield in North Africa that would shape Israel's politics for decades to come. After the War of Yom Kippur, the focus of the conflicts in the Levant had shifted to Lebanon, a former French-mandated territory that had the most diverse religious landscape in the Middle East, including a large Christian community. Internal conflicts and the arrival of the PLO to the country in the early 1970s led to the outbreak of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. Israel became involved in the early 1980s and managed to force the PLO out of the country in order to protect the northern border of Israel. Arafat and the PLO went into exile in Tunisia, and they spent the rest of the 1980s and early 1990s in North Africa. Meanwhile, a new movement emerged amongst the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank against Israeli rule late in 1987. This is known as the First Intifada. There was now the question arising within Israeli politics as to whether or not Israel needed to reach an accommodation with the PLO in order to avoid a situation where Israeli citizens were plagued by terrorist attacks on a near continuous basis and to prevent more radical Palestinian groups emerging to overtake the PLO. Therefore, in the early 1990s, talks were entered into with the PLO with a view to establishing a peace process that would allow for the creation of a Palestinian state out of some of the lands which Israel had held for decades. The Oslo Accords, which were negotiated between Israel and the PLO in the first half of the 1990s, outlined a plan whereby a Palestinian state would be ushered in, over time consisting of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. It would not be as large as the planned Palestinian state under the UN Plan of 1947, but after nearly half a century, a plan was in place again for a two-state solution. Likud won the 1988 Knesset elections, and the leader, Yitzhak Shamir, continued on as Prime Minister of Israel through the early stages of the peace process. However, in 1992, owing to the perceived failure of Likud to deal with the first Labor won fresh Knesset elections, and Yitzhak Rabin became the new prime minister. He and his foreign minister, Shimon Peres, then negotiated the Oslo Accords and were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994, alongside Yasser. In response to the defeat in the 1992 elections, Shamir stepped down as leader of Likud. In March 1993, Netanyahu was elected as his successor. This was a turbulent period in Israeli politics, as the country was increasingly divided between those who were in favor of a negotiated settlement to the Palestinian issue that would allow Israelis and Palestinians to live peacefully alongside each other, and those who believed that the only way to secure Israel's future was by establishing a strong military state. The divisions in the country were made abundantly clear when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated on the night of November 4, 1995, in Tel Aviv, at the end of a rally in support of the Oslo Accords. His assassin was Yigal Amir, an Israeli extremist who was opposed to the peace process. This combined with several major Palestinian terrorist attacks, such as the Jaffa Road bus bombings of February 25, 1996, paved the way for fresh Knesset elections in May 1996. In the vote, Labor won a slightly larger share than Likud, but Netanyahu was able to negotiate a coalition, which brought him to power as Israel's youngest ever prime minister, at 46 years of age. The new first family consisted of him and his third wife, Sarah. He had divorced Fleur Katz in 1984 and married Sarah in 1991. They have two sons together, Yahia and Avner, born in 1991 and 1994. Netanyahu's first term as Prime Minister of Israel was very different to his later time as leader of the country. In 1996, the United States was viewed as the sole, triumphant superpower of the world after the end of the Cold War. In this environment, the goal of President Bill Clinton and his administration was to further the two-state solution, regardless of who was in power in Israel. Netanyahu was aware of this and had to conform to American wishes in a way which he could not do years later. Thus, for instance, he agreed to the Hebron Protocol in January 1997, which outlined plans for further Israeli withdrawal from the south of the West Bank, the core component, part of the planned Palestinian state, along with the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. However, at the same time, Netanyahu tried to obstruct the process in other ways. For instance, he opposed making further concessions on dual sovereignty over Jerusalem. His attempts to manage competing interests ultimately lost him support. Hardline Zionists were opposed to any further concessions to the Palestinians, but to those who supported the Oslo Accords and the peace process, Netanyahu was not going far enough. This collapse in his support, combined with emergent corruption charges against him, led him to a no-confidence vote and the calling of early elections for May 1999. The Knesset elections on May 17, 1999, produced one of the most fragmented parliaments in Israeli history. Likud vote fell to just 14%, while more hardline right-wing groups like Shoes surged, as opponents of the peace process moved away from the center ground. Ultimately, a coalition of parties from both the left and right was patched together by Ehud Barak, the leader of the Labour Party, and he succeeded Netanyahu as prime minister, albeit the government was always on shaky foundations and only lasted 2 years. In 1999, Netanyahu relinquished the leadership of Likud to Ariel Sharon and left politics to return to the business world. It was only a brief hiatus, though. In 2001, when a new prime ministerial election was held, many within Likud contacted Netanyahu to encourage him to run as an alternative to Sharon, while Netanyahu declined to do so. A year later, he accepted an offer to return to government as the Minister for Foreign Affairs. In Sharon's cabinet, meanwhile, the peace process was coming undone. A second intifada had begun in Israel and the Palestinian territories in September 2000. It would go on for 4.5 years and demonstrated that the PL was being outflanked by more militant Palestinian groups, such as Hamas. It did not help matters that the elderly leadership of the PLO, in the form of individuals like Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas, were revealed to be highly corrupt after assuming power in Gaza City and Ramallah. Crucially, the second intifada was much more violent than the first. A decade earlier, with mass terrorist bombings targeting civilian centers in Israeli cities. Netanyahu, as a prominent Israeli politician, was swift. When fresh Knesset elections were held in 2003, Likud's support surged to nearly 30% of the vote. The perception was that Labour had led Israel into the peace process, and the outbreak of the second intifada was a signal that it had failed, leaving Israeli citizens even less secure than they had been at the time of the first intifada. Consequently, Sharon continued as prime minister, and he surprisingly promoted Netanyahu, his main rival for power within Likud, to the post of Minister of Finance. Over the next 2 years, he initiated a series of neoliberal economic reforms, which privatized state assets. There was an economic surge between 2004 and 2007, earning Netanyahu supporters in the process, though it is debatable as to whether or not this was simply a rebound. After the second intifada had created a mini economic crisis in the early 2000s. That particular crisis had started to abate by 2004. In November, Yasser Arafat died, under possibly suspicious circumstances, in a hospital in France, and his successor, Mahmoud Abbas, negotiated an end to the intifada at the Sharm el-Sheikh summit in February 2005. The new peace plan involved Israel disengaging from the Gaza Strip, a process which was completed quite quickly. In the autumn of 2005, Netanyahu opposed the move, declaring that it would hand the Strip over to Hamas. He resigned from the government in protest, and would soon secure control over Likud once again, as Israeli politics entered a fresh period of flux. Although Sharon had attempted to cut off any potential leadership challenge by bringing Netanyahu into government, following the disengagement from Gaza, it was clear that he had lost support. He therefore decided to leave Likud and establish his own party, Kadima, out of the more moderate wing of Likud. This left the pathway clear for Netanyahu to become leader of Likud again. However, a majority of the party's supporters abandoned them. In the Knesset elections on March 28, 2006, Likud's vote fell to just 9%. And Netanyahu led only 12 members into the 120-seat Knesset. Kadima won the election, and Ehud Olmert became the new prime minister, As the clinically obese, Sharon had suffered a series of strokes in December 2005 and January 2006 that left him in a coma, which lasted for 8 years. Before his death, in January 2014, in opposition to Olmert between 2006 and 2009, Netanyahu set out his stall as an opponent of the developing political situation. Hamas had come to power in the Gaza Strip after winning the Palestinian elections in 2006, leaving the PLO in charge of the West Bank, and effectively creating two different Palestinian entities. A war developed between Israel and Hamas thereafter, until an Egyptian broke its ceasefire in 2008. Netanyahu fiercely opposed this, arguing that it would simply allow Hamas to rearm, without any benefit for Israel. Netanyahu's emergence as the preeminent political figure in modern Israel began with the Knesset elections of February 2, 9. More than doubled its showing from 3 years earlier, and secured 22% of the vote. While this was fractionally behind Kadima, Netanyahu was better placed to pull together a large coalition of Likud and the smaller parties that made him prime minister. Since then, he has nearly continuously been prime minister of Israel, with the exception of an 18-month period between the summer of 2021 and December 2022, though his leadership has frequently been unstable, with many Knesset elections during this period. His approach to government during this time is sometimes described as the Netanyahu Doctrine. Effectively, what Netanyahu has overseen is a move away from the peace process towards the creation of a security state, which aims to expand Israel's presence in the Levant. This has been made possible by increased militarization and the development of high-tech security mechanisms, such as the Iron Dome air defense system. In tandem with this security drive, the Netanyahu Doctrine has aimed towards making Israel self-dependent by building up its economy, rather than relying, as previous generations of Israelis did, on huge financial subventions from the Jewish American community and the U.S. government. This agenda of developing a security state as an alternative to the peace process and bolstering the Israeli economy, particularly its tech sector, have characterized Netanyahu's time in power. In some ways, it has been successful, but in other ways, it has failed to provide long-term security. Netanyahu's approach to the Palestinian problem and Israel's enemies in the surrounding region, most notably Hezbollah in Lebanon, occurred alongside a succession of conflicts in the 20s. On November 14, 2012, Netanyahu's government launched Operation Pillar of Defense, an 8-day war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. A much more violent conflict occurred in Gaza in the summer of 2014, while in May 2021, the short-lived unity led to violence in Israel itself, the West Bank, Gaza City, southern Lebanon, and the Golan Heights. Clearly, there were mixed reasons for these clashes at different times, while the lack of anything approaching effective leadership from the PLO in Ramallah and their intense corruption further destabilized any progress towards furthering the peace process. Yet Netanyahu was often criticized. Too many European leaders, especially in France, were critical of the manner in which he pulled away from the peace process from 2009 onwards. Ultimately, it was the United States that mattered, though, while Netanyahu's relationship with the U.S. president from 2009 to 2017, Barack Obama, had started reasonably well. It declined over the years, especially so from 2013 onwards, after the U.S. entered into negotiations with Iran, Israel's foremost adversary in the Middle East, to try to improve relations, which had been antagonistic since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. This resulted in the Joint Plan of Action in 2015, whereby Iran agreed to suspend elements of its nuclear program. In tandem, Obama spent much of his 2 terms as president criticizing the continued expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which are deemed to be illegal under international law. given the intermittent wars, the violence, and the threats to Israel's international security. A person might wonder how Netanyahu has managed to remain in power for so long. This is particularly peculiar, given the nature of Israeli politics, where a deeply divided Knesset means that no party has been able to secure more than about 30% of the vote nationally since the early 1990s. Despite these impediments, Netanyahu has managed to survive politically as Israel's leader. He cobbled together a broad coalition in 2009 and became prime minister, despite Likud coming second behind Kadima in the election. In the 2013 elections, Likud's vote share fell again to nearly 21%, but Netanyahu allied with 5 different parties, including ultra-Orthodox entities like Shas and the more centrist Yesh Atid, to ensure he returned to power during numerous elections that were held in quick succession between 2019 and 2021. Netanyahu even managed to see off a major threat from the Blue and White Party alliance, led by retired IDF General Benny Gantz. While he lost power briefly between the summer of 2021 and the end of 2022, he returned as prime minister in December 2022 by forming a coalition primarily comprised of Likud and far-right parties like Shas and Atzma. The latter was largely made up of former members of the Kahani Party, an Israeli political group that was designated as a terrorist organization by the United States in 2004. As such, Netanyahu's government formation in December 2022 was viewed in both Israel and abroad as a striking move to return to power. Netanyahu's position was strengthened by the end of Obama's term as president of the U.S. in 2017. His successor was Donald Trump, a Republican president whose administration was known to be much more sympathetic to him. Netanyahu was able to exert renewed influence in Washington, D.C. during Trump's first term. For instance, at the end of April 2018, Netanyahu presented a cache of documents and gave a speech in which he alleged that Iran had secretly breached the terms of the nuclear deal negotiated by Obama. Just over a week later, Trump declared that the U.S. would be leaving the deal and reimposing full economic sanctions on Iran. More broadly, Trump's first term was significant in that Netanyahu made significant steps during it towards Israel, normalizing relations with the rest of the Arab world. Prior to this, Israel had only been recognized by Egypt in 1979 as part of the Camp David Accords, and Jordan in 1994 as part of the signing of the Oslo Accords. In 2020, the Abraham Accords were concluded. Through these, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain recognized Israel, and Morocco and Sudan followed soon after. They demonstrated how business and money, rather than religion and common ethnic allegiances, were now shaping the Middle East in a way which had not been the case back in the 1940s. Netanyahu looked forward to the ultimate goal of managing to have Saudi Arabia, the emerging economic superpower of the Middle East, recognize Israel. The Abraham Accords were a diplomatic coup for Netanyahu, yet they also came at a time when his political stock was declining. Israel was going through numerous Knesset elections in quick succession, and allegations about his corruption in office were growing. Israel, it must be said, has a culture of corruption at the top of the state. While early leaders of the country, like David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir, were not accused of misconduct in office, nearly every prime minister of the country since the start of the 1990s has been, though the charges against Shimon Peres, for example, were comparatively minor. Ehud Olmert, however, was convicted on charges of bribery and sentenced to 6 years in prison in 2014. Charges of corruption had been leveled against Netanyahu during his first term as prime minister. Between 1996 and 1999, allegations grew. After he returned to lead the government, from 2009 onwards, for instance, he is believed to have accepted gifts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years in order to loosen tax laws to favor residents returning to Israel from other countries, and to secure us visas for several Israeli citizens. One of the cases against him, Case 2000, concerns his relationship with Arnon Moses, the owner of Yedi, a leading Israeli tabloid newspaper. Prosecutors assert that Netanyahu reached an agreement with Moses, whereby legislation would be introduced to benefit the paper. In return, Moses would provide positive media coverage of Netanyahu. These were some of the charges that led to prosecutors beginning to press for Netanyahu's indictment. From 2018 onwards, the issue of Netanyahu's alleged corruption was starting to build into full protests. By 2019, as a quick succession of Knesset elections failed to result in the formation of a stable government, Likud was still emerging, with between 25% and 30% of the vote. But the blue and white alliance of Benny Gantz was neck and neck with Netanyahu. It was from this point onwards that a succession of crises began to combine to keep Netanyahu in office and avoid prosecution. For instance, protests calling for his prosecution were starting to escalate. In the first months of 2020, when the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic severely curbed them, protests of this kind effectively became illegal under emergency legislation passed in mid-March. While a government of national unity was formed to deal with the crisis, after the initial from the first wave of the pandemic had ended, mass protests against Netanyahu began again. By 2021, it was clear that he could not hold on to power, and a new government was formed in June 2021 out of a broad coalition of parties from all sides of the political spectrum, with Naftali Bennett serving as prime minister initially. Throughout all of this period, legal proceedings were underway to bring Netanyahu to trial. Once he was out of office, the likelihood was that he would be convicted of at least some of the multiple charges against him. Hence it seemed, in the summer of 2021, that while the COVID-19 pandemic had temporarily delayed his fall from power, Netanyahu's political career was coming to an end, with a jail sentence to follow. In 2022, it appeared that Netanyahu would not be able to pull off another comeback, but that is what he did. The government that was formed by Bennett and others in the summer of 2021 was so with the thinnest of majorities. Just 61 votes in the 120-seat Knesset. Every vote was needed to keep the government alive. It did not prove possible to maintain cohesion for long. In such an ideologically divided government, the sole coherent goal of which was keeping Netanyahu out of power. After less than a year, its working majority collapsed, paving the way for Netanyahu to return to power at the end of 2022. The new administration was steeped in controversy from its first days. The new Minister for Justice and Deputy Prime Minister, Yariv Levin, proposed as soon as he entered office to implement wide-ranging judicial reforms that would give the government of the day greater control over the Supreme Court of Israel. The separation of powers between the judiciary and the executive is a key element of any modern democracy, one which ensures that the government of the day is still answerable to the law. A huge number of Israelis believed that the judicial reforms were designed to ensure that Netanyahu was not convicted of corruption charges, and that he had tighter control over the judiciary. Huge protests were seen in the months that followed, with tens of thousands of people gathering in cities like Tel Aviv. These were sustained over many months, from January 2023 through to early October. In the end, the judicial reforms would not be passed in the manner which was initially proposed in January 2023. A so-called reasonableness law, whereby the government could strike down judicial decisions, was temporarily passed in the summer of 2023, but it was overruled at the start of 2024. The bigger issue is that judicial reforms and the protests surrounding them were largely shelved as a result of the coordinated Hamas attacks on Israel from the Gaza Strip on October 7, 2023. That morning, thousands of rockets were fired into Israel from the Gaza Strip with the goal of distracting Israel's defense systems. Then, thousands of Hamas militants broke through the Gaza, Israel perimeter defenses and attacked into Israel. The full scope of the attacks has been well documented. For instance, around 364 Israelis were killed at the Nova Music Festival that was being held near the Israeli side of the border. Attacks on Israeli kibbutz and incidences of sexual violence also occurred all along the border region. Approximately 250 hostages were then taken into the Gaza Strip. Thousands more were killed and wounded in the most destructive attack on Israel in half a century, and an event which was immediately compared to the 9/11 attacks on the United States by Al-Qaeda in 2001. In terms of the psychological scars it would leave on the nation of Israel. No sooner had the October 7th attacks occurred than criticism within Israel began to focus on Netanyahu. Questions were asked as to how the attacks had been allowed to occur in the high-tech security state. How, for instance, had Israeli satellites not detected unusual behavior around the Gaza side of the physical boundaries, which divide all of the Gaza Strip from Israel? Or how had Israeli intelligence services not picked up some information about a potential attack? Another criticism was that the police and the focus of the IDF itself were distracted by the judicial reform protests in Tel Aviv and elsewhere, which were directly related to Netanyahu's attempts to escape prosecution on serious corruption charges. Finally, within hours of the attacks, tensions began to run high about the entire strategy employed by Netanyahu over the previous 14 years. For instance, on the day after the attacks, October 8, 2023, the Times of Israel ran articles arguing that Netanyahu's entire doctrine had been partly responsible for them. It claimed he had actively promoted the divide in the Palestinian territories over many years in order to weaken the PLO and the Palestinian Authority in Ramah, in the process emboldening Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Hence, even though Israelis were united by anger in the wake of the attacks, Netanyahu did not escape criticism and felt the need to bring Benny Gantz's alliance and several other parties from across the political spectrum into a unity government in the wake of the attacks. Netanyahu oversaw the Israeli response to the October 7th attack through late 2023 and beyond, into 2024 and 2025. The prolonged war has been highly controversial and also quite multifaceted as it has expanded into conflicts in many other parts of the Middle East. Initially, there was a consensus in Europe and North America that the unity government that Netanyahu led was justified in striking back at Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It also succeeded over time in having a large number of the hostages that were taken into Gaza released as part of extensive prisoner exchanges. Over time, though, in 2020 for the consensus on whether Israel was acting appropriately or not broke down. The key issue was not whether or not Israel had a right to wage war on Hamas itself, but whether or not at the direction of the Netanyahu-led government, was engaging in an intentional campaign to kill civilians in the Gaza Strip, specifically by not allowing insufficient aid of all kinds, from food and clean water to medicine and fuel. On November 21, 2024, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Netanyahu, citing war crimes of starvation as a method of warfare, and of intentionally directing an attack against the civilian population as the reason for the issuance of the warrant. Netanyahu has also extended the war into other parts of the Middle East. For instance, no sooner had the attacks on October the 7th commenced, but has the Iranian-backed Lebanese terrorist organization began firing large numbers of rockets into northern Israel. The border region had to be emptied out as a result. In response, the Israelis began their own bombing campaign into Lebanon, including Beirut, in the summer of 2024. This was expanded into a ground invasion on October 1, 2024. Attacks by the Yemeni terror group the Houthis on shipping in the Red Sea has also resulted in Israeli and U.S. attacks on that entity. Finally, After trading minor attacks in the autumn of 2024, Israel launched a large-scale bombardment of Iran on June 13, 2025, on Netanyahu's orders. This was in response to a clear effort by Iran to accelerate its nuclear program in response to the damage inflicted on its proxies in several countries throughout the Middle East. In 2024, the U.S. joined the 12-day war 9 days later by bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. In the period that followed, though, Netanyahu appeared to have gone too far for nearly all of his allies. In the late summer of 2025, in response to a fresh campaign in Gaza, the European Union began to consider altering its trade agreements with Israel, while an Israeli missile attack on a Hamas delegation in Qatar on September 9 elicited a stern phone call to Netanyahu by U.S. President Donald Trump, as Qatar is a firm regional ally of America. Many European and Western nations also moved in 2025 to recognize Palestine as a state, in response to the manner in which Netanyahu's government has acted. At home, thousands of Israelis have once again begun protesting against Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu faces an uncertain future. The Trump administration that entered office in the United States in January 2025 has switched its policy with regard to the Gaza Strip on numerous occasions. But it appears to have settled on the idea that Israel should not be allowed to completely take over the Strip, and that an international peacekeeping force will be deployed there. It's debatable whether Netanyahu will be the Prime Minister of Israel who oversees this process. He faces mounting opposition from many different fronts, owing to his alleged corruption, heavy-handed policies, and proposals to force ultra-Orthodox Jews into military service. Opinion polls suggest that he will potentially lose power in the upcoming 2026 elections, in part because his opponents are divided on many things, but united on opposing him. Much like the coalition that ousted him from power in 2021, if it goes wrong for Netanyahu, he may be facing a jail sentence in future years. Whether a person likes or loathes him, Benjamin Netanyahu is the most important individual in modern Israeli politics. His life almost exactly overlaps with the State of Israel. He was born in October 1949, slightly over a year after Israel had come into existence. For the first part of his life, he lived between Israel and the United States. It was only from the late 1980s that he firmly committed himself to life in Israel, after his political ideology was shaped by the death of his brother, Yonatan, in the Entebbe raid of 1976. When he first entered the Knesset in 1988, his ascent within and the government was very quick. In 1993, he became the leader of the opposition as head of and in 1996, he became Israel's youngest ever prime minister at 46 years of age. Since 2009, he has dominated Israeli politics, holding power continuously since then, except for a brief period of a year and a half between June 2021 and December 2022. His stance on issues has changed over time. While Netanyahu has always been to the right of Israeli politics, he has drifted more to the right over time. In the late 1990s, for instance, when he first held office, he was forced to adhere to the peace process by the United States. But since 2009, he has pursued a strategy which seeks to delegitimize the and the two-state solution, instead pursuing a goal of building up Israel as a technological security state. Corruption charges have dogged him in office, and prior to Hamas's attacks on Israel, on October 7, 2023, Netanyahu looked like he was on borrowed time. Politically, it remains to be seen whether he will be able to hold on to power in the years to come. What do you think of Benjamin Netanyahu? Is he responsible for the collapse of the two-state solution as a road to peace between Israelis and Palestinians by choosing to turn Israel into a security state? Or is the Netanyahu doctrine a practical solution to a peace process that was not working?